If you told me 10 years ago that Peacemaker would be a key part of the Detective Comics cinematic universe, the DCU with its Fortnite skin, people copying his dance and sparking weekly social media conversations, I definitely wouldn't have believed it. Before James Gunn gave him major character development, Peacemaker was a largely forgettable and seldom used Detective Comics character. I mean, he was basically the character you called when Jason Todd, Deathstroke, Deadshot, Sportsmaster, and even the Condiment King had already been cancelled. It was truly the bottom of the barrel. This makes sense, since the character was never that interesting in the comics. Basically, he was one of those violent anti-heroes whose only redeeming feature was an ideological contradiction he had, since he was a pacifist who was willing to wage war to achieve peace. With this in mind, a logical option to develop the character would have been to make him an antagonist, a character who represented this duality that currently exists in the world, where there are many people willing to seek peace through war. However, I think The Boys already does that well, so I like that James Gunn chose a different approach. One through which he took a violent, little-known character with racist attitudes. He made us empathize with him over 2 seasons. How does a broken person try to deal with the mistakes of his past and overcome his upbringing with the intention of becoming a better person? Something that shouldn't have worked actually did, and I'll explain why. Let's begin. Before discussing today's Peacemaker, we need to mention his earlier comic version. Peacemaker was originally a Charlton Comics character before becoming popular in Detective Comics and getting a Fortnite skin. A diplomat who despised violence and whose mission was to prevent an international war. He realized he couldn't take the easy way and said, "I hate violence, but my mistakes could cause thousands of innocent deaths. I have to do what I vowed never to." In this first appearance, just as we saw in the series, the dove symbol represents his commitment to peace and his vast arsenal, his commitment to, he's going to smash your face in, right? However, the character appeared in only a few comics before Detective Comics bought Charlton and added it to its catalog. With the story of Crisis on Infinite Earths, where Peacemaker has a cameo, well, a small one. A few years later, Detective Comics released a 4-issue Peacemaker series, depicting him for the first time as violent and disturbed. The son of a German Fruitzi, who is so emotionally troubled that he believes he talks to his dead father during missions. Despite everything, he is still fixated on achieving peace through war. Although here he is much more brutal than in his first appearance, since he tries not to kill innocent people. He regrets the collateral damage, but not enough to stop. This was basically the Peacemaker who appeared very sporadically in Detective Comics. Basically, a violent character cliche full of weapons, like the Punisher. See? This is a bit similar to what we saw in John Cena's first appearance as Peacemaker in the movie The Suicide Squad. We mainly saw him as skilled with weapons, confident, obedient, and ideologically conflicted. Which, in this case, James Gunn made funny. They call you Peacemaker. And given how the character was in the comics, it made sense to do it. He's an antagonist, starting out as one, and should have died at the movie's end. And this is when you start to realize that the Peacemaker series should never have existed. Because really, everything was against it. Not only was it a very little known character from the comics, but the role also wasn't written for John Cena.
I wasn't the first choice.
Of James Gunn. One that humanizes an antagonist so well that he's now beloved by fans and a pillar of the new Detective Comics universe. But I think John Cena said it best.
James didn't have me in mind first, and then he killed me in the Suicide Squad. And we had so much fun making that movie. He broke his rule of never bringing back someone you kill. And for me to make such an impression on such a brilliant creative mind that he breaks a cardinal rule that he has, and for us to go on to do good work together and develop a great friendship, and that's what made it a day at the office.
But how do you turn a violent and somewhat unlikable antagonist into a protagonist that people are interested in and truly feel empathy for? It turns out that James Gunn is pretty good at doing that. In fact, if you look closely, that's the trick that made him famous. since the Guardians of the Galaxy are initially introduced as a kind of reluctant anti-heroes, meaning characters who don't want to be heroes but are forced by circumstances to act heroically. As the movies progress, we notice a shift as they become more stereotypical heroes. Peacemaker and the 11 Street Kids present a similar case, since at the beginning of the first season we see them one way, and by the end of the second season they are completely different. For example, in the first episode, Peacemaker is known as both a superhero and a rapist in his world, because strangely he watches minorities more than whites. In other words, at the beginning of the series, we perceive Peacemaker the same way we did in the Suicide Squad. Here, James Gunn reveals more of his personality, suggesting his violence and biases may have an origin. This Peacemaker scene is brilliant because it quickly develops the character. When Christopher Smith, also known as Peacemaker, goes to visit his father Augie after having spent several years in prison, Augie opens the door and greets him in a very cold manner. Inside the house, Chris tries to make his father care by revealing he just got out of prison and spent months in the hospital. He even tells him that someone shot him and that a building fell on him. However, the only thing that seemed to matter to his father was that Chris let someone shoot him. Discussing personal matters doesn't seem effective. Chris tries to chat about trivial things like whether he bought a new lamp, something about a phone plan. He tries sharing his excitement about seeing Aigley with his father, but nothing works. Augie is not interested in establishing communication with his son. This scene is tough to watch, as it shows Peacemaker emotionally vulnerable and desperate for the first time for communicating with his father. The saddest part is that Chris initially tries to get his father's attention just because he's his son. Gradually, he accepts less. Eventually, only one topic sparks Augie's interest. Chris tells him about his old teammate Bloodsport, his fear of rats, and how it began when his father locked him in a box with hungry rats as a child. Changing the subject seemed effective. Chris and Augie seemed connected at that moment, despite discussing a father's psychological abuse of his son. However, you could see in Peacemaker's body language that he really didn't want to talk about this, and was just pretending to enjoy the subject, because he was seeking his father's attention. This definitely wasn't the connection he was looking for, but he decides that crumbs of affection are better than having nothing at all. And here you start to understand that this happens very often in Chris's life, that many times he resorts to violence in a desperate attempt to establish a connection with his father, to seek a kind of recognition or affection that he never gets. Not because it was in his nature to be violent from the beginning. However, in his case, upbringing weighs heavily, and years of constantly linking violence with affection have left Christopher Smith permanently scarred. And that's exactly what we see in the series, Chris's emotional journey and how he tries to be a better person by going beyond his upbringing. I also like that James Gunn updated the character's social context using elements from the post-crisis Peacemaker in this run, like the fact that he's the son of a German footsie and that he sees his dead father, but instead of making him the son of a German footsie, since his last name in the comics is Schmidt, not Smith, he places him in a much closer context. Here he made him the son of Augie Smith, a working-class white supremacist and leader of groups like the Comedicanto Club, committed to crimes against those they see as different. Peacemaker grows up among people in trailers, with minimal education, supremacist views, and who consider violence normal. In fact, if you pay attention to several parts of the series, they mention that Chris is not the smartest or most articulate person in the world. But even so, the series also tells us that he is a person with a big heart, and above all, that he has a great need to express his emotions, particularly through music and his taste for glam or hair metal bands. In fact, I finally understood what the openings of Peacemaker mean. We first need to know that this idea involves the cast dancing in the opening. It's not from the Peacemaker series. It originally appeared in an earlier James Gunn movie, Super, a film featuring a main character who is naive, inarticulate, and somewhat dumb. Just like Peacemaker, he draws pictures of moments from his life and of the people in it to stick them on his wall. He views his life as a story, with those around him as the supporting cast. Drawing them dancing helps him understand his world and express his emotions despite his artistic limitations. Peacemaker does this in his series too, as he's often described as not very cultured or articulate. Still, we see in him a strong need to express his emotions and, above all, connect with those around him. I think these openings, where the cast performs mechanical choreography with blank faces, unconsciously express Chris's desire, a poorly articulated fantasy just like him, where everyone, friends, enemies, protagonists, and antagonists, moves in the same choreography, all synchronized and dancing, well or badly, with him.
There's also a change between the first and second choreography.
The first season's music immediately grabs you and suggests a person who seems more confident and focused on superficial things, like appearing cool or tough. The music and choreography in the second one take longer to click, but by season's end they make a strong impact. Because it feels like the desperate cry of someone struggling to hold on to the bonds they've formed, and who does everything possible to keep moving forward despite the huge pile of mistakes they've accumulated over the years. That's why I feel that the opening is much more than just comic relief. In my opinion, it's a narrative device and part of the character's development. It's a window into Chris's mind. He may not express himself artistically as he'd like, but he does so deeply and genuinely. So as viewers, we make an emotional connection with these openings. Gradually, we see him more as a person and less as the antagonist from the Suicide Squad. This dynamic is evident in Harcourt, who initially despises Peacemaker in Season 1. Not only does she see him as a brainless stalker, but he also killed Rick Flag Jr. However, Chris gradually proves he's more than he appears and eventually wins Harcourt's affection. The same thing happens with Economist. At first he thinks Chris is just a big bully who enjoys causing others pain. But later, we also realize that he is actually trying to make friends. He just doesn't know how to do it well. That's something Economist realizes too, and they end the first season as friends. This dynamic repeats with Adebayo, who regrets betraying him and ultimately sees Chris as a true friend. It's like each character slowly grows to care about Chris. This works because, like us, we begin to care about him. Like most stories about broken people, this one can't stay happy for long. At the start of Season 2, he's depressed after multiple rejections. He also faces the accidental killing of his doppelganger. From the other Earth, he eventually reaches Earth X to start his life over. A world where he has a loving family, is hailed as a hero, and is with hardcore. What could go wrong? Safe? Well, it turns out a lot of things could. In my last video, I discussed the social issues on Earth X and how they relate to the real world. But in this video, I want to focus more on Peacemaker's emotional journey. Because it must have been very difficult for him to realize that there's a reality where he didn't kill his brother. They both grow up loving each other, and he still has a family, only to lose everything again later. This is one of the best Peacemaker scenes, not just for its emotion, but also because it fits the character well. In this scene, Chris sees his friends mortally wound his father while rescuing him from his Earth X family. And they're about to do the same to his brother, until Chris shouts and makes them stop. This must have been very difficult for him, as he has lived his whole life regretting accidentally killing his brother. In his world, he tries to please a father who wants nothing to do with him. Imagine being in his place. In this scene, Chris loses both his family again and his chance at redemption. He loses the illusion that maybe, somewhere in the universe, his life could have been better, and that if things had been different, maybe he wouldn't feel so alone. The scene is effective thanks in part to John Cena's strong performance as Peacemaker, who gives a heartbreaking scream, which, strange as it may seem, doesn't sound like the scream of a grown man, much less someone like Peacemaker. Instead, it feels like a child's scream desperate to end the pain, which makes perfect sense here. But, especially at this moment, Chris seems to come to a conclusion that, for him, is inevitable. He is to blame for his own pain and responsible for the pain he has caused others. At this point, an emotional arc ends for the character, as Chris has spent the series seeking forgiveness for his brother's death, and trying to fill his emptiness with violence, with missions, and trying to fit in without being able to achieve it. And when finally he seemed to have found some peace, it seems like life tries to take it away from him again. I like that they don't just leave the character like that, but also show that not everything is his fault. We can see this in another one of the scenes I love from the second season, where Leota Adebayo says she believes in miracles and thinks he's a good person because of him. And she points out to Chris that every time something bad happens, it's not just because he acted badly, but also because he didn't know how to listen to himself. He once listened to his father, leading him to commit violence against minorities. Then he listened to Amanda Waller and eliminated Rick Flag, and later he went to Earth X, even though he knew he shouldn't have done it. Yes, each of those things was Chris's fault, but in the series they show you that his biggest mistake was not listening to himself, not following his own conscience. Which I really like, because this way the character is still held responsible. At the same time, they present him as someone worthy of our empathy and who tries to go against his upbringing. Peacemaker isn't a perfect series. Some elements, like Chris's visions of his dad, never become relevant again. There are storylines that don't add anything, like the whole arc of Eagly being a mystical eagle, or characters acting out of character. Everything with Rick Flag at the end takes a backseat for me, since I mostly enjoyed seeing the character develop. I'm sure you know that Superman is my favorite superhero, but I genuinely think that after these 2 seasons and many extremely well-planned and emotional scenes, Peacemaker is the best developed character in James Gunn's entire career. This concerns a personal matter. Recently, James Gunn cried during a roundtable, since he said that for him, the most emotional part of the Peacemaker ending was precisely this scene, where Liotta de Bayo convinces Chris to stay.
The thing that touches him the most in the episode is when she looks at him and tells him that he's big and that he's dumb and that he's stupid. But when I'm around you, I know that I love you.
He says he's crying not only because of the scene and Daniel Brooks' performance, but also for a more personal reason.
I'm also crying because that's my
father. This makes me think that James Gunn might have seen his father as this extremely strong figure, a rock he could lean on, just like many of us see our fathers. But at the same time, he didn't connect with him in other ways. Gunn said his father never fully understood his love for comics and movies, but he still felt supported by him. Qualities that we can also find in Jonathan Kent from the Superman movie, who doesn't fully understand his son, but is definitely there to support him. Another important point is that Gunn has also described his father as an example of change, since in his words, he went from being a closed-minded, prejudiced, alcoholic, homophobic, and violent person to being someone who reflected on his mistakes and spent his life making amends. He stopped drinking, got involved in social causes, and became the most important person in James Gunn's life until his death in 2019. So much so that we can find a bit of him in each of James Gunn's movies. Films in which flawed father figures abound, but in the end, many of them prove to have a great capacity to love and to care. This makes me think that each of his anti-heroes and each of the fathers we see in his movies, it seems to represent an aspect and a time of how James Gunn saw his father. In his words, he went from being a guy he wrote angry teenage punk rock songs about to being the first person he turned to when he needed advice. I love my father as much as I've ever loved. With all this emotional baggage, do you see why Peacemaker succeeded when it shouldn't have? The series shouldn't have existed since it focused on an obscure character. It shouldn't have been played by John Cena because the role wasn't written for him. And it shouldn't have worked because it was about an antagonist with a violent past who seemed beyond redemption. However, it existed and it worked. And I think this is one of the most impressive achievements in Gunn's entire career. Turning a character who had everything against him into a pillar of the new Detective Comics universe. Don't leave yet. If you liked this video essay, you would help me a lot by subscribing to my channel to see more videos like this. Here's another video I made on Peacemaker focusing on social issues, plus one on the Superman movie. If you made it this far, I assure you that you'll like them. That's all for today. I'm Go the Geek Monitor, and keep looking beyond the obvious.